The Burke and Hare murders were a series of 16 murders committed over a period of about 10 months. In 1828 in Edinburgh, Scotland, the killings were undertaken by William Burke and William Hare, who sold the corpses to Dr. Robert Knox for dissection at his anatomy lectures. Edinburgh was a leading European centre of anatomical study in the early 19th century, in a time when the demand for cadavers led to a shortfall in legal supply. Scottish law required that corpses used for medical research should only come from those who had died in prison, suicide victims, or from foundlings and orphans. The shortage of corpses led to an increase in grave robbing by what were known as resurrection men. Measures to ensure graves were left undisturbed exacerbated the shortage. When a lodger in Hare's house died, he turned to his friend Burke for advice and they decided to sell the body to Knox. They received what was, for them, the generous sum of 7/10. A little over 2 months later, when Hare was concerned that a lodger suffering from fever would deter others from staying in the house, he and Burke murdered her and sold the body to Knox. The men continued their murder spree, probably with the knowledge of their wives. Burke and Hare's actions were uncovered after other lodgers discovered their last victim, Margaret Docherty, and called the police. A forensic examination of Docherty's body indicated she had probably been suffocated, but it could not be proven. Although the police suspected the men of other murders, there was no evidence on which they could take action. An offer was put to Hare granting immunity from prosecution if he turned King's evidence. He provided the details of Docherty's murder and confessed to all 16 deaths. Formal charges were made against Burke and his wife for 3 murders. At the subsequent trial, Burke was found guilty of 1 murder and sentenced to death. The case against his wife was found not proven. A Scottish legal verdict to acquit an individual but not declare them innocent. Burke was hanged shortly afterwards. His corpse was dissected and his skeleton displayed at the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh Medical School where, as of 2017, it remains. The murders raised public awareness of the need for bodies for medical research and contributed to the passing of the Anatomy Act 1832. The events have made appearances in literature and been portrayed on screen, either in heavily fictionalized accounts or as the inspiration for fictional works. Background: Anatomy in 19th century Edinburgh. In the early 19th century, Edinburgh had several pioneering anatomy teachers, including Alexander Monro, his son who was also called Alexander, John Bell, John Goodsir and Robert Knox, all of whom developed the subject into a modern science. The situation was confused by the legal position. Disturbing a grave was a criminal offense, as was the taking of property from the deceased. Stealing the body was not an offense, as it did not legally belong to anyone. By the 1820s, the residents of Edinburgh had taken to the streets to protest at the increase in grave robbing. Dr. Robert Knox. Knox was an anatomist who had qualified as a doctor in 1814. After contracting smallpox as a child, he was blind in one eye and badly disfigured. William Burke and William Hare. William Burke was born in 1792 in Erney, County Tyrone, Ireland, one of 2 sons to middle-class parents. William Hare was probably born in County Armagh, County Londonderry or in Newry. His age and year of birth are unknown. When arrested in 1828 he gave his age as 21. But one source states that he was born between 1792 and 1804. In 1827, Burke and MacDougall went to Pennycook in Midlothian to work on the harvest, where they met Hare. The men became friends. When Burke and MacDougall returned to Edinburgh, they moved into Hare's Tanner's Close lodging house, where the 2 couples soon acquired a reputation for hard drinking and boisterous behavior. Events of November 1827 to November 1828. On the 29th of November 1827, Donald, a lodger in Hare's house, died of dropsy shortly before receiving a quarterly army pension while owing £4 of back rent. There is no agreement as to the order in which the murders took place. Most of the sources agree that the first murder in January or February 1828 was either that of a miller named Joseph lodging in Hare's house, or Abigail Simpson, a salt seller. The order of the two victims next after Joseph is also unclear. Rosner puts the sequence as Abigail Simpson followed by an English male lodger from Cheshire. Burke met two women in early April, Mary Patterson, also known as Mary Mitchell, and Janet Brown, in the Canongate area of Edinburgh. At some point in early to mid-1828 a Mrs. Haldane, whom Burke described as a stout old woman, lodged at Hare's premises. After she became drunk, she fell asleep in the stable. She was smothered and sold to Knox. Burke and Hare murdered two lodgers in June, an old woman and a dumb boy, her grandson, as Burke later recalled in his confession. On the 24th of June, Burke and MacDougall departed for Falkirk to visit the latter's father. Burke knew that Hare was short of cash and had even pawned some of his clothes. When the couple returned, they found that Hare was wearing new clothes and had surplus money. After he was asked, Hare denied that he had sold another body. Burke checked with Knox, who confirmed Hare had sold a woman's body for $8. It led to an argument between the two men and they came to blows. Burke and his wife moved into the home of his cousin, John Brogan, or Brogan, 2 streets away from Tanner's Close. The breach between the two men did not last long. In late September or early October, Hare was visiting Burke when Mrs. Ostler, also given as Ostler, a washerwoman, came to the property to do the laundry. The men got her drunk and killed her. The corpse was with Dr. Knox that afternoon, for which the men received $8. Burke and Hare's next victim was a familiar figure in the streets of Edinburgh, James Wilson, an 18-year-old man with a limp caused by deformed feet. He was mentally disabled and, according to Alana Knight in her history of the murders, was inoffensive. He was known locally as Daft Jamie. Idealized etching of Burke murdering Margaret Docherty, also known as Marjorie Campbell, by Robert Seymour. The final victim, killed on the 31st of October 1828, was Margaret Docherty. The next day the Greys returned, and Anne became suspicious when Burke would not let her approach a bed where she had left her stockings. When they were left alone in the house in the early evening, the Greys searched the straw and found Docherty's body, showing blood and saliva on the face. On their way to alert the police, they ran into MacDougall, who tried to bribe them with an offer of $10 a week. They refused. In total, 16 people were murdered by Burke and Hare. Developments, investigation and the path to court. On the 3rd of November 1828 a warrant was issued for the detention of Burke, Hare and their wives. Brogan was released without further action. Although the police were sure murder had taken place, and that at least one of the 4 was guilty, they were uncertain whether they could secure a conviction. Sir William Ray, the Lord Advocate, followed a regular technique. He focused on one individual to extract a confession on which the others could be convicted. Hare was chosen and, on the 1st of December, he was offered immunity from prosecution if he turned King's evidence and provided the full details of the murder of Docherty and any other, because he could not be brought to testify against his wife. She was also exempt from prosecution. Statement given by Burke in January 1829 to the Edinburgh Courant, in which he states, Dr. Knox never encouraged him, neither taught or encouraged him to murder any person. Trial. The trial began at 10:00 a.m. on Christmas Eve 1828 before the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh's Parliament House. The case was heard by the Lord Justice Clerk, David Boyle, supported by the Lords Meadowbank, Pitmilly and Mackenzie. The court was full shortly after the doors were opened at 9:00 a.m. The case ran through the day and night to the following morning. Rosner notes that even a formal postponement of the case for dinner could have raised questions about the validity of the trial. In the early afternoon, Burke and MacDougall pleaded not guilty to the murder of Docherty. The first witnesses were then called from a list of 55 that included Hare and Knox. Not all the witnesses on the list were called, and Knox, with 3 of his assistants, avoided being questioned in court. In the early evening, Hare took the stand to give evidence under cross-examination about the murder of Docherty. Hare claimed Burke had been the sole murderer and MacDougall had twice been involved by bringing Docherty back to the house after she had run out. Hare stated that he had assisted Burke in the delivery of the body to Knox. "Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." Aftermath, including execution and dissection. MacDougall was released at the end of the trial and returned home. The following day she went to buy whiskey and was confronted by a mob who were angry at the not-proven verdict. She was taken to a police building in nearby Fountain Bridge for her own protection. But after the mob laid siege to it, she escaped through a back window to the main police station off Edinburgh's High Street. On the 16th of January 1829, a petition on behalf of James Wilson's mother and sister, protesting against Hare's immunity and intended release from prison, was given lengthy consideration by the High Court of Justiciary and rejected by a vote of 4-2. Burke was hanged on the morning of the 28th of January 1829 in front of a crowd possibly as large as 25,000. Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomical Museum of the Edinburgh Medical School where, as of 2016, it remains. Hare was released on the 5th of February 1829. His extended stay in custody had been undertaken for his own protection, and was assisted in leaving Edinburgh in disguise by the mail coach to Dumfries. At one of its stops he was recognized by a fellow passenger, Erskine Douglas Sanford, a junior counsel who had represented Wilson's family. Sanford informed his fellow passengers of Hare's identity. On arrival in Dumfries, the news of Hare's presence spread and a large crowd gathered at the hostelry where he was due to stay the night. Police arrived and arranged for a decoy coach to draw off the crowd while Hare escaped through a back window and into a carriage which took him to the town's prison for safekeeping. A crowd surrounded the building. Stones were thrown as the door and windows and street lamps were smashed before 100 special constables arrived to restore order. In the small hours of the morning, escorted by a sheriff officer and militia guard, Hare was taken out of town, set down on the Annan Road and instructed to make his way to the English border. Knox refused to make any public statements about his dealings with Burke and Hare. The common thought in Edinburgh was that he was culpable in the events. He was lampooned in caricature and, in February, a crowd gathered outside his house and burned an effigy of him. Legacy. Legislation. The question of the supply of cadavers for scientific research had been promoted by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham before the crimes of Burke and Hare took place. The murders committed by Burke and Hare raised public awareness of the need for bodies for medical purposes, and of the trade that doctors had conducted with grave robbers and murderers. The East London murder of a 14-year-old boy and the subsequent attempt to sell the corpse to the medical school at King's College London led to an investigation of the London Burkers, who had recently turned from grave robbing to murder to obtain corpses. 2 men were hanged in December 1831 for the crime. A bill was quickly introduced into Parliament, and gained royal assent 9 months later to become the Anatomy Act 1832. In media portrayals and popular culture, The events of the Westport murders have made appearances in fiction. They are referred to in Robert Louis Stevenson's 1884 short story, The Body Snatcher, and Marcel Schwab told their story in the last chapter of Imaginary Lives. Our Irish importation have made a great discovery of economics, namely, that a wretch who is not worth a farthing while alive, becomes a valuable article when knocked on the head and carried to an anatomist, and acting on this principle, have cleared the streets of some of those miserable offcasts of society, whom nobody missed because nobody wished to see them again. Orphans. The shortage of corpses led to an increase in grave robbing by what were known as resurrection men. Measures to ensure graves were left undisturbed exacerbated the shortage. When a lodger in Hare's house died, he turned to his friend Burke for advice and they decided to sell the body to Knox. They received what was. The Burke and Hare murders were a series of 16 murders committed over a period of about 10 months. In 1828 in Edinburgh, Scotland, the killings were undertaken by William Burke and William Hare, who sold the corpses to Dr. Robert Knox for dissection at his anatomy lectures. For them, the generous sum of 7 pence. A little over 2 months later, when Hare was concerned that a lodger suffering from fever would deter others from staying in the house, he and Burke murdered her and sold the body to Knox. The men continued their murder spree, probably with the knowledge of their wives. Burke and Hare's actions were uncovered after other lodgers discovered their last victim, Margaret Docherty, and called the police. A forensic examination of Docherty's body indicated she had probably been suffocated, but it could not be proven. Although the police suspected the men of other murders, there was no evidence on. Edinburgh was a leading European centre of anatomical study in the early 19th century, in a time when the demand for cadavers led to a shortfall in legal supply. Scottish law required that corpses used for medical research should only come from those who had died in prison, suicide victims, or from foundlings and